Hello, I'm Joe Paiva for Construction Education Associates. This course is some of the basic math principles associated with the business of construction. So we're calling it Math Tips for Construction Part 1. And this is a couple of slides just on some of the basics. I'm not going to go through it in detail. You can read it for yourself. But the main thing is to understand some of these simple rules. Use a calculator when you're doing your calculations. And then if you're not good at using a calculator, make sure you practice using it, especially any special functions that might be there, or how to do a string, how to calculate when you have a whole string of numbers there that you've written out. I tell people keep a notebook and write down the numbers that you're calculating clearly so that you actually know how you manipulated and you know what you divided by what, and when you took a square root and all those kinds of things. Don't ever mix units. That's not so important in the business math. Usually you can keep those straight. But certainly if you're calculating volumes or areas or whatever, you don't mix inches and feet or square feet and square yards and so forth. I always tell people when you're calculating something, maybe you're trying to figure out what your bid needs to be, carry everything out an extra decimal place or two, and then only round it back down at the very end. And if you're doing things that involves fairly complex shapes, I suggest using graph paper so you can draw it to scale, so you can kind of determine if the answer you calculated using your calculator and the numbers, the equations, whatever it is that you used, that you actually get the correct result. Not that important for most parts of business math, but certainly part of business math is doing things like estimating. And so you might bring in some of the calculations associated with computing how much in the way of materials you need to buy, or how much your rate per square foot or cubic yard or whatever linear foot needs to be. And so you do sometimes have to use the graph paper even for your business calculations. So we'll start by talking about percentages, which by the way is not markup. We'll get to that. The thing about percentages is that forces you to think in decimal. When we often say half, what we mean is half of one of anything, the whole number, half of everything you own, half of your house, half of the class, half of a pizza, whatever it is. What we're saying is it's 0.5. Half of one is 0.5. And this converts to 50%. How do you do that? You multiply your raw number or your decimal by 100, which basically shifts the decimal place 2 places to the right. So where the decimal place or the decimal point was before the 0.5, it's now after the 0. So you need to remember, first of all, to shift between them. So if you have 33%, that's roughly a third, 0.33 as a decimal. If you have 75%, that's 0.75 and so forth. So let's say you have a project that you will invoice for $65,000. Your cost of materials is going to be $13,500. What percentage of your project is materials? So this is a fairly straightforward calculation. You take your $13,500 divided by your $65,000, your total build. You divide it and you get 0.2077. So what this means is you shift the decimal point over to get 20.77%, or you might round it to 21%. But that's how you do that particular calculation. Hopefully that's fairly straightforward. So we'll move on to another question. For the same project, you know that your labor costs will be 36.3%. What is that in dollars? So set up what you know and don't know as equations. So we know X over 36.3 is equal to 65,000 over 100. All right, so this is the total cost of the project. We know it's 36.3%. X is the cost in dollars, and we have 100%. So you simply cross multiply once you've set up this equation. And so you notice I put those two red lines in there. So we multiply X by 100 to get 100X. We multiply 36 by 65,000, all right? And then to get the correct answer, we divide both sides by 100. So the equation that you're going to run through with your calculator is 36.3 times 65,000, that's what you see here, divided by 100. And the answer is 23,595. Sometimes you need to calculate percent increase or decrease. So your material supplier just gave you a heads up that everything is going to be up by 2.8% by the time you take delivery. How much more money is this? So the delta, all right, so let me pause and talk about delta. Delta simply means the change, which could be a change up or a change down. It's a Greek letter, and it's very common in business to use a delta. You'll often hear financial people talk about it. So I thought, why not introduce the term delta? Because you may already be familiar with it, but it simply means the change. How much more money is this means how much is the change in what the invoice is going to be from your supplier because of this 2.8% increase. So the delta is going to be 2.8, and you divide that by 100 to make it 0.028. You're shifting the decimal place back because you want to use the decimal, times 13,500. So you wind up with the information that it's going to cost you $378 more. And so that's how you get to that answer. Now there is another way to do it, and we'll talk about here. So you add the 378 to your original cost to get 13,878. But there's a little bit more direct way to get directly to the delta if you recognize that if you have, you know your materials cost right now 100%, it's going to go up by 2.8%. So it's going up to 102.8%. So in this case, I wrote 102.8 over 100 times 13,500. 102.8 converts to 1.028. And when you multiply it out, you get 13,878, which is exactly the same thing we got by doing it with an extra step. So it depends on your comfort with the math. You can do it one way or you can do it the other. And as you work on this more and more, you may discover that one works for you more reliably than the other. Here's a percent decrease for a business. So your business did $874,000 in revenues this year. But last year you did $1,093,500. So what is the percent decrease? The dollar decrease is easy. You simply subtract these two numbers. So if I take 874 and subtract from 1,093,500, if I did that subtraction, I would get the 219,500. That's your decrease in revenues. That's your delta, if you will. It's a negative number in this case. So you can set up an equation to cross multiply where you say the part of your dollars that you've dropped compared to your whole amount of dollars is equal to the part of the percentage over the whole. So in this case, it would be 219.5 divided by 1,093,093 because you're trying to compare to last year's revenue. And that's equal to X over 100. What's your current level of decrease compared to last year's revenues? And when you cross multiply, I went through the cross multiplication already, but you would have X times 1,993,500 is equal to 219.5 over 100. And so you divide both sides by 1,093,500, and you would get 20.07%. So your business has dropped. So if you're actually writing this in absolute terms, if you put in a negative 219.5, then you would get a negative 20.07% here. Okay, so using markup to achieve a gross profit is something that people make some pretty big mistakes with. So let's say you estimate that it will cost you $100,000, or excuse me, that you will bill a total of $125,000 because you can do the project for 100,000, but you want to make 25,000 profit on it. So if you didn't have profit figured, you would bill for 100,000. So because I used 100,000 just because that's an easy number to work with, and you might look at this and say, oh, that's 25% profit. But it isn't, because your gross profit is based on the total amount billed. So your profit is 25,000, but your markup is only 20,000. And so in this next slide, you see that 25,000 divided by 125,000 times 100 gives you 20%. So even though you made $25,000 on a project that basically cost you $100,000 to do, you're only making 20% profit. So if you really want to make 25%, you go at it a slightly different way, because you have to begin by using the total amount billed. So make sure that that's how you do it. Here's a different calculation. You know that you want 10% profit and your overhead is 13%. So your gross profit, which is basically your business profit as well as your overhead, needs to be 23%. So here, what you would do is divide all your costs to do the project by 0.77. Now, where did that number come from? Makes you think a little bit. So if your gross profit is 23%, first of all, recognize that 23% is 0.23. And that's what you have to add to all your material and labor costs. But you do that not by adding, but by dividing by 0.77. Here's how we get the 0.77. We take the whole, what we're going to bill, we're going to subtract off the 0.23, because your material and labor accounts for 0.77 of the whole project if you really want that 23% gross profit. So if the sum of your materials and labor costs $125,000, what should you bill to achieve 23% gross profit? You would take the 125 you're going to bill, or that it's going to cost you divide by the 0.77, it gives you 162. And so this is where it gets to be a little tricky, because you can often wind up undercharging your clients because you erroneously calculate the profit incorrectly. So we'll have much more of this kind of discussion in the specific discussions for different license exams, but look for more BAT discussion in other courses, as well as our free content on the CEA, Construction Education Associates YouTube channel. Thanks for listening.